Good evening, everybody. It's Monday, the 18th of September. You're here at Neuro at Night. Tonight, Richard's going to be talking about some of the research he's done looking at asymmetries. So this will be well, for me personally, a very interesting topic. I like that phase, that part of the mapping system and looking at the asymmetries because it can oftentimes be very educational and tell us a lot about particular patients. So that's the plan for tonight. It will be recorded, I understand, and then posted. So I think, are we going to keep Richard? Are you going to keep people on mute and then unmute them towards the end, or you want to ask questions as you go?
I unmuted them, but they can
Okay.
ask questions as we go if they have a burning question.
Ah, all right. Well then, it's all yours. Take it away.
Okay, make sure people can see. Can you see that? Is that
Yep,
showing up?
frontal alpha asymmetry neurofeedback. Yada yada. Got
Yeah, it is, yada yada.
it.
They're Italian researchers, and
Ah,
but they did pretty good. It's a little tough in spots, but the English is pretty good.
yeah.
In fact, I find that sometimes foreign writers, science writers, write better than the Western writers because they keep it simple because it's not their primary language, and it's a lot makes a lot more sense. And all these people trying to make exotic, inflated verbiage, to impress
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to talk about asymmetry. Uh, since I'm updating the web course, I have to do a total search of all research on topics, all the different things, disorders and so forth, because we've got to have the latest in the web course. I mean, relatively latest. It doesn't have to be the latest because it's you're learning the basics, and a lot of the basics were set down 20, 30 years ago. But people like to see the latest on the protocol section. And it's really worth it to keep track of the latest protocols, particularly for us, because it's incredibly supportive for what we do at NewMind. We do asymmetry protocols, and you all know that. That's what they are primarily. And there's a very specific reason we do them, because some time ago, in the 90s, everybody in neurofeedback took an interest in Rosenfeld and Bayer's research about asymmetry, and it was based on research by Davidson done in the 80s, starting with babies. But he looked at affect and alpha asymmetry. And that was because alpha was considered a sign that the brain was idling, and so it wasn't active, whereas beta was active. And they thought, well, that's a good way to check on what areas are most active in the brain. And the thought was that left hemisphere, when it's active, it's engaged in approach and external activity. And the right hemisphere is less active in that state. Well, when a baby withdraws and becomes less active, there's more alpha on the left and less beta. And so the alpha asymmetry is reversed, and that's a withdrawal state. And Davidson related that to depression. And so we have Rosenfeld and Bayer's research, and it wasn't big groups or anything like that, but it was good research. And they established that indeed it looked like if we're just looking at alpha asymmetry, we can reduce depression by training the alpha asymmetry in the front of the brain. Around the same time, the Alzheimer's had developed protocols too. and everybody had their set of protocols and their followers. It's not much different than today. And the alchemists were doing beta up, which stimulated the left hemisphere, or SMR up to reduce the activity. So you could do that on either side, beta up or SMR up on the left or on the right to speed up or slow down the brain. That was kind of the way they thought about it. It was an arousal model. And they trained on the left a certain amount, on the right a certain amount, depending on the symptoms, and everything was done that way. Well, everybody started to grow up with QEG and move beyond that because that was the new thing, and it would solve all our problems. There's always a new thing that's going to solve all your problems, whether it's S-Loretta or Z-score or network or God knows what else. And that's good. We want people exploring new things, but people tend to go overboard a lot of times. I was talking to Elsa and Tom Kalura at ISNR, and we were having a discussion about the topic of asymmetry and a lot of other things. And Elsa had said, well, the protocol that Rosenfeld came up with was patented, and you had to pay. And Bob Kragle joined the conversation. He's an oldie but a goodie from Tucson, one of the most pioneering people I know in the field. He tried out everything. He said, yeah, that's kind of a bummer. Why would he do that? Now we can't explore it in the clinic. We have to pay him every time we use it. And Tom said, well, wait a second, that's just log alpha left right minus log right divided by 2, and it's an equation. And, that's kind of tough anyways for your average clinician to figure out. And Elsa said, yeah, it is. Definitely. You don't have to do that. You can just train alpha down on the left and alpha up on the right. And she says, come to my workshop and you'll see. So I went to the workshop, and Elsa had a student, a grad student, who could make herself cry by focusing on sad images. And they had a big meter up on the stage, and she made that needle go left or right on asymmetry just by focusing very intensely on sad thoughts and happy thoughts. And they had somebody else doing that too. That really amazed me. That impressed me. And not only had the theory, some research, and I could see it happening. But I had to reconcile that with beta and SMR. And I went to Siegfried and I said, what do you think about 2-channel training? Valdine Brown's been proposing you do beta on the left, SMR on the right at the same time. And maybe you could even involve asymmetry training in alpha or something like that. And Siegfried, he said, I love the idea. That way you could see exactly what was going on in each hemisphere while you did it. He said, but I don't think we're going to go there. We have this infralow thing that we're much more excited about. And he just said, good luck with that asymmetry thing. So I started experimenting in my clinics. I had 5 around the country in the United States in the 90s, and I was running all of them and doing the brain mapping and interpreting them. And we experimented with that a lot, and we came up with, we did experiments with the clients, and I reported them at the meetings. And I came up with this more detailed paradigm, and I called it bihemispheric compensatory model of neurofeedback training. And I was really into this. And Tom was not interested because he was all excited about um, S Loretta. Well, at the time we only had Loretta, but and full cap training, and he wanted to go there, and because he's an engineer, and that was the most complicated way to do it, and that excited him, and he thought that must have tremendous power. That'll be it. The more places we can train, the more powerful it would be. Well, that was just a theory, and it didn't necessarily jibe with my understanding of the brain. So we had slightly different, all of us had slightly different models in our head. And he went off on that, but I wrote it up, and it was a chapter in Handbook of Clinical QEG and Neurotherapy, edited by Tom Clora and John Frederick, who edits a lot of my writing too. He's great. And I put down the basics for that model. So you can go to that book and look at that chapter, and you can see everything I'm about to tell you that these guys somewhat explored something like 20 years later. Now, a lot of the stuff we take for granted, and we do all the time if you're doing NeuMi, but outside of us, the majority of people are still doing single channel protocols, and a small percentage are doing Z-score, which is really complex stuff, and a lot of clinicians, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to them. It's really technical. So a lot of people are interested in what we're doing because it's technical, but not too technical, and it really works, and it's basic. So this research, not just this paper, but all the papers in the last 10 years have been incredibly supportive and borne out this theory of compensatory training. And they even use the term, some of the research are using the terms reorganization and normalization. I mean, they're actually using the terminology and the concepts, which makes sense because they're researchers, and that's what the neuroimaging people, those are the terms they were using. That's why I picked them up, specifically from the researchers at Harvard, because I was excited about what they were doing. Again, it was supportive of some of the theories I had about the brain and what was going on. But I had the theory about asymmetry in my mind. I liked it because the MRI showed activation and deactivation, and they were doing a lot of amazing stuff with that. And you could see it confirmed by this high-end, highly funded research. And EEG alpha and beta were similar to activation and deactivation. Now, everybody's made a mistake because if you look at the actual co-registration studies between QEG and fMRI, the two in particular, Rosa et al. Is one of the definitive one. You can see that delta and theta compared to alpha. Delta and alpha is active. I mean, beta is activating, but it's delta and theta which are deactivating. Pretty much. Now you can include alpha, but it really is a complex algorithm, which it couldn't be done right now with neurofeedback in the clinics. But basically, delta and theta is close enough, and that's what it says. That's what it's all about on your when you train. It says delta and theta is activation. So the word activation means how much delta and theta compared to beta. And that's an algorithm which is very close to perfusion and glycogen utilization, glucose and oxygen in the brain.
Can
So
I
we
ask a quick
have,
question?
yeah,
And if I'm getting ahead of you, just say so. So when you're looking at a map, if you had a map where you had dominant beta on the right, you know, the anxiety, if you will, And then you had dominant, your delta was dominant on the right. Would that be deactivating that beta because that's what it does?
You would have a conflict. Yeah, you can have both at the same time. Some of the cell assemblies are producing beta, and some of them are producing excess delta. So you have a complex mix, and it's really hard to figure out what's going on when that's happening. But if you have normal levels of delta and beta, beta would be activating only. But you could have a conflict.
Okay, thank you.
And that's not always obvious, and it's hard to understand. I remember running into that question and having to research it for years to get an answer. The main thing that it comes down to is alphas and idling, and it's not totally related to activation, but it's enough so that it shows an effect when there's an asymmetry in the brain. So as it turns out, when all is said and done, how effective is this concept of alpha asymmetry? In you know, did I chase a non-existent rabbit down the hole? Well, no. There are 8 RCT studies on depression and 14 RCT studies on anxiety that involve asymmetry in the last 10 years. That's almost 20 studies. These are random controlled designs. Um, so people are randomly assigned to different groups, and then they're usually trained with sham and real neurofeedback. Now, there's all of them. Every study has slightly different way of breaking the groups down, but no matter how they do it, this is considered the highest quality design. And all the studies have 25 to 75, some have a little bit more people in the studies. That's a good study, especially when you get up close to 70. The number of people, if the sampling is done right, is an approximate representative of the population, and it's pretty close, according to something called the central limit theorem in statistics. So 20 studies, and some of these are the reliability is incredible because they're replicating in detail other studies, and sometimes they're replicating but with variation to find out more. So when you look at this and you think about MRI studies, and they find a group of 16 people or something, and they do an MRI study, and they find something really interesting, it's suddenly published, in in all the journals, and it hits the news, and big pharma goes after it, and everybody's excited. There's a gold rush that's on. When you do it with the EEG, it's like, people yawn, well, we'll have to wait and see. Got to have more studies. We have, in neurofeedback, over 20 studies in the last 10 years, robust, well-done RCT studies that show efficacy for anxiety and depression reduction with asymmetry training. Now let that sink in. That's about as good as it gets. I mean, you could do 200 people or 100 people would be perfect. But some of these studies have 70. I mean, it's close enough. And they're really, really good studies. So don't ever let somebody, browbeat you about the efficacy of neurofeedback on anxiety and depression, at least, because it's there. I mean, it's ridiculous that anybody would challenge it. And it's really solid. And asymmetry is really good because you know what? A lot of these studies have as little as 5 sessions and show significant change in the EEG using pre-post cues, Beck inventories, Hamilton inventories, and cortisol levels, sometimes other things on blood samples. I mean, it's really good stuff. I was impressed. I had no idea. And they're international studies. Of course, that's how we got them, because in the US, it's where we invented neurofeedback. It's, well, let's move on, and everybody in the rest of the world saying, like, hold on, this is amazing stuff. So thank good for all the other countries, whether it's Taiwan or Spain or Italy. I mean, they're doing great stuff for us in the field. So that's cool. Now, this particular one by Manila et al. Was from 2017, and there's a 32 in the N size of the group, and they only used 5 sessions to do alpha training. They did asymmetry training, like a lot of other people that, F4 minus F3 over 2, and it's usually log F3 and F4. So they're all doing that type of protocol. And some people did other ones where they didn't, but it's mostly all that. And what's interesting is this group used asymmetry training to determine if they could reduce anxiety. Well, traditionally it was all depression, and there were 8 studies done RCT on depression. So I found it amazing that 14 studies, and this is one of the latest. Well, not the latest. There's 3 later ones, but it's one of the best ones, because they said, well, we're doing asymmetry training, but nobody's really checked out the fact that what's happening specifically to alpha and maybe even beta when you do asymmetry training. Does alpha in the left hemisphere go down, or does it stay the same when you train? The difference, does alpha in the right hemisphere go up, or does it just go up a little and left goes down? I mean, everybody's thinking asymmetry, well, left goes down a little, the right goes up. It's probably how it works. Well, they found that training on the equation, that alpha stayed the same on the left, but it went up on the right. And that they found very fascinating. And this is where they discussed frontal alpha power and where it came from. The balance between activity left and right prefrontal is associated. And I just picked out some statements in here that are interesting. 5 sessions of frontal alpha neurofeedback using rewarding and non-rewarding tones. Okay, it kind of clues you in what's going on. They were concerned because previous studies observed modifications driven by changes in alpha power at right, left, and both frontal sites, but they didn't check out specifically what the alpha was doing, just that there was a difference in the algorithm. So they did bipolar montage, which it breaks from the traditional protocol, and they did alpha F3 and referenced it to CZ, which is the traditional reference for alpha asymmetry. Although there are studies done with alpha linked years, and alpha 4 to CC, and then alpha FC to CZ. So they have 3 bipolar montages. They're training up alpha on the right, and I mean, not well. Let me amend that. They take F3CZ and F4CZ, compute the difference, and then give you an image on the screen and a tone, so you can focus on changing both. And then they had another group where they did only FC alpha up and for control group, and that was their comparison group. So They did 5 minutes, and what's different about these thing is they do trials, 5 minute. I believe it's 5 minutes, and everybody does different length of trials, and they rest them for a minute, and they do another, and they do 30 minutes of it or 50 minutes of it. This is what the researchers are doing, because a lot of them want to be very specific, and that's, how are they doing in the first part of the trial of the session versus the second trial of the session, third. They like to break it down to controllable segments so they can compare everything. It's just what researchers do. And the difference was left to right to left, F4 minus F3. They had visual feedback, and the FC people had visual feedback too, the same visual feedback, only it was alpha increasing. Let's see if we can find that. They tell F3 and F4 are log transfer formed. So it's still that traditional method. And they find that it was effective. With Beck inventories, they looked at the difference. They also, some of these studies do computerized performance tests, cognitive tests, to see if cognition is changed by alpha asymmetry training. And what they find is cognition is incredibly improved by asymmetry training. And that supports our stance that cognitive functions are dependent upon stable affect, because it's the last stage in evolution. In humans, the emotional brain is older. And if it's not working right, then the cognitive brain is working right. It's kind of like that statement, if the mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. If the emotional brain ain't right, then the thinking brain ain't right. And it gives us a good reason to always do affect training, training anxiety and depression, getting that out of the way to really determine how much they actually need cognitive training. It also sheds light on the fact that all these people are saying, oh, ADD is a cognitive issue, when really a lot of it's emotional, anxiety and depression. And that was my experience when I measured kids and adults in the clinic I was in. You really have to go over the emotional stuff. You have to get that balance out before you know what really is the deficit, because that will destabilize the whole cortical function. And they looked at it and they said, they talked about Davidson there, and they said all participants who underwent frontal alpha asymmetry training showed both a decrease in right frontal activity and a parallel reduction in subjective measures of negative affect and anxiety. So there was an increase in right, but there wasn't a decrease in the left side. And they noted that, and they thought it was very interesting. And they said, maybe you should just train the alpha down on the left side since it doesn't go down, because there was no improvement in positive affect. We didn't get a positive improvement in affect. And they thought that was because the alpha didn't go down in the left. Now remember that, because we're going to talk about that in a minute. What do you do should you get that alpha down, which doesn't go down? And how should you do it? Should you train alpha down, or what? Maybe beta up? Well, researchers thought about that, and other ones. said anxiety symptoms have been found to be associated with increased right to left frontal activity as measured in alpha asymmetry. Also, this cortical pattern has been related to heightened negative affect with withdrawal tendencies. That's an interesting statement. So there's a problem here in that some of the past studies have found that you can get some negativity out of this, even though it calms people down. And we've noticed that when you do asymmetry, people do get kind of negative for a while. And that's an interesting statement too. And the other studies shed light on that as well. We have hypothesized that in order to impact on clinical depression, neurofeedback should be aimed at increasing left compared to right frontal activity, thus stimulating approach and avoidance. So they're saying, oh, well, maybe also we could do beta up or something like that to increase activity to get rid of depression. This was a new idea for them. Meanwhile, you've been doing this at NewMind for 15 years if you've been around that long with us. At the same time, the possibility that clinically depressed patients would benefit from alpha asymmetry cannot be ruled out. Well, that's an odd statement. They're so impressed by what anxiety has happened and how little affected depression because the alpha didn't go down. They're saying, well, if you increased it on the left, the activity, and did this, then maybe you can have the best of both worlds. For instance, in depressed individuals, the same training could decrease alpha at the left and right sides in contrast with the pattern observed in our sample, thus being beneficial in this regard. My computer just blanked out. I'm back. It's back. Can you hear me, Rob?
Yeah, we hear you. And your slide was up, and then you said it blacked out. It just went out for a minute, and now we're back. I can hear you. We see your
Yeah,
slide.
my whole screen and computer goes out. I've got to get a new one.
Yeah,
I've never
technology.
seen that happen. It only happens with GoToMeeting. Intriguingly, a number of studies support the notion that alpha and beta bands are inversely correlated with activation of the underlying neural structure as measured by functional resonance imaging, both at rest. They're saying, well, they might be inverse. You train alpha up on the left, alpha down on the right, alpha down on the left, alpha up. Hey, that might work. We should try that and get experiments on it. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, we should try that. We've been doing that for 15 years with thousands of over 100,000 people. NeuroMind is trained using that protocol. And they're just saying, hey, we got an idea from this research. We could do it this way, which is interesting. So they're proposing what we've done. Now, real quick, because time is passing, I just want to look at this other piece of research. And Wang et al. And this is from 2019. And he had 87 subjects. Yeah, so 87. That's a really significant sample. I mean, you're going to get good statistical quality out of that if it's done right. And it's an RCT training. And they did log F4 minus log F3 in one group, but they had another group and they did P3, P4, high beta down. And these both were done linked ears, not reference to ZZ. And he had significant results. again, using things like the Beck. I think he used the Beck and Hamiltons too. And this, I don't recall exactly. I've got 20 of these floating around my head. They swirl together at a certain point. But yeah, it was the Beck. Significant decreases on depression and anxiety scores. So he found alpha asymmetry with linked ears got anxiety and depression, where the last study you just saw, CZ referenced, only got improvements in anxiety. That's a very interesting situation and deserves more thought and research. But Wang is even closer to what we're doing. So linked ears is valid. And in fact, Richie Davidson, in his original research piece, said that he had done some linked ears and it was effective too, you know, and it was like 2 lines in the research paper, and everybody seemed to ignore those lines, but I didn't, and Tom didn't. So this is the same thing, but they did the beta down in one of the control groups, and guess what they found? Beta down, high beta down at P3, P4, reduced depression and anxiety. What? Well, we used to do alpha up training and beta down training at PZ and P4 all the time. And when Rob came in, we were doing protocols like that when Rob and I first got together. It's around 2005, 2006. These were among the many protocols that people were using, and we were getting good results. And we just kind of went for the asymmetry because it got so many factors in one shot. It did so much, like they found in this research, F4 and F3 with alpha on both and linked ears, and you could get alpha, you could get anxiety and depression at the same time. That was incredible. And what if you did beta up on the left and something down on the right? You could add more things happening at once. You're doing multiple protocols at once. What you're doing is you're controlling the activation by controlling alpha and beta. You're controlling enough of the activation in the hemisphere at a fine grain level that you can get amazing results with anxiety and depression, and add another protocol or two in on top of it, depending on how you construct them. So you can see why I went anterior posterior, because this is posterior beta and the alpha's anterior alpha. You can see why I did asymmetry all anterior to posterior and to use quadrant theory to develop these protocols. And the research is incredibly supportive, and not 10 sessions, 5 sessions on these things. There was one guy who did 1 session and found significant. I have a problem with that, but it was just post-session. It wasn't, pre-post a long series of sessions like for 20 sessions or 30 sessions. So this is all pretty neat stuff that it comes down to. Make it even more complicated, Liu et al. 2022, and found that with 33 subjects, he could train SMR at C3 for 6 sessions over 3 weeks and get relief from anxiety. So SMR is similar to alpha. You train it on the left, and it doesn't produce excess alpha, but just reduces activation enough to relieve anxiety on the left side. So SMR has a very interesting way of controlling arousal too. And so the authors were right, and he proved it, that beta up on the left, SMR up on the right, or vice versa, you are controlling the level of arousal, but you are also controlling the level of perfusion and activation in the brain. And that's kind of neat. Another group of Qian et al. In 2016 did beta up at F3. Right? So beta up at F3, and this time activating beta in people who were depressed. And he did that to correct for asymmetry. He just did beta up. He said, well, if I just activate the left side, the right should follow. And this is all getting at dynamics in a brain system. And these people are thinking the same thing sometimes. And he also trained alpha down at PC. Get that? Well, we know alpha down with traumatized people calms them down. So if you have people who are depressed because of trauma and they didn't test for that, it would work. But in a sense, he's doing two protocols at the same time. He's doing beta up at F3, like we heard, and he's doing alpha down at PZ. That's like Nicholson. And that's probably where he got the idea, because I don't know anybody else who trained alpha down at PZ. Oh, well, I do. No, that's not true. They were training SMR up at PC to reduce frontal alpha, according to Jay Gunkelman, and getting good results. But we haven't seen alpha down except for Ross et al., which is around earlier than this, and Nicholson later on, 21, 22, 23 on alpha down. And he demonstrated clearly with MRI that works when you use EEG. So he was kind of a fortunate mix, but you can do two protocols at once. So you begin to see how simple this can be, or also how complex with asymmetry, and all doing variations on alpha, beta, and SMR, left versus right. And if you look at the NeuMind protocol, that's all they're about. And they're done by, it decides what to do with the protocol, which protocol to do where, by looking at the statistical abnormality in 5 neurometric dimensions of each pair of homologous sites in the brain. So these people have been validating everything we've been doing, but of course we were just following the MRI research from the beginning anyways, and following the research on networks and following the research on nonlinear systems in the brain. And again, Valdine Brown played into this. To a certain degree, this is what Valdine Brown's doing, but he's only doing it C3, C4. We're telling you, you've got to move around more. And he's using a more complex algorithm to do it. We're just doing, one thing, one side down, one side up with different frequencies to control for symmetry. So the linked ears works. Beta up left or alpha down activates the left hemisphere. Beta down or alpha up calms down the right. Any combination should work, but it is important what exactly the combination is. That's determined by the quadrant rule, and it's important to have statistical analysis to determine where's the weakest homologous site where this is going to make the biggest difference, because you can do it front or back. So that's basically my presentation. It's kind of loose, but because I'm learning this stuff from the research of the past 10 years, this is pretty recent for me. And I haven't totally digested it in terms of what's the next step or the implications, for NeuMind and what we're doing. But it certainly bears out that we're doing is extremely well validated, extremely robust, which I believe based on the research, but I'm relieved to see so much supporting it. That's why the protocols work so well. So I thought you all might find all of those things interesting. I don't know, I found them stunning and opened up new doors, thinking of 2 protocols at once and different things you could do. And there's many more of these pieces. I just highlighted some of them and went through 2 and 1 in particular in detail. Anybody have a comment or question?
My comment would be it really supports a lot of the my biases after working for years with asymmetry protocols. It's one of the reasons when I'm working with anxiety, for example, I love working in the back and using asymmetry protocols because they tend to work, and I tend to go 5 sessions, with each protocol, and then if I'm mentoring somebody, say, look, if something works really well, stay the course and do 10 of them,
Yeah.
But working P3, P4 is great. 0102 is great for depression, F3, F4, and I even like FP1, FP2 because of the mood regulation stuff. And when I combine those, 0102, P3, P4 into a 4-channel, they're highly effective. If I combine F3, F4, FP1, and P2 together into a 4-channel with depression, they're highly effective. I've had great results.
Yeah, that's new. I mean, that's relatively innovative, and that you're probably right based on what we've seen, and you experience it as really effective, and it
Oh yeah,
probably is.
I've had people who were never left the house and were cutters using that protocol for depression, and went the exact opposite. Started driving their car, went to visit family in another town, clean the house out, clean the garage out, put the trash in the
Yes.
trash can. I mean, on
When
and
they
on.
start cleaning up the things, or
You know.
or you're creating order within creates order
Yeah,
without. Yeah,
yeah.
they clean up the
So
messes in your
yeah.
life.
So I enjoyed it simply because it really reinforces a lot of the way I like to work with those disorders, and fits for me very well.
Yeah, and this gives you an overview, a quick overview. All of this stuff will be in the updated web course, so you don't have to go anywhere. You all have taken the web course, or most of you have, and these updates and all this information will be in the updated version when it comes out. So you get to read it all again and find all the latest stuff.
Hmm.
That's the good thing about it. Every 4 or 5 years we update it. Some of it may be not clear to you, but we'll be going over it and over it in lunch and learns going forward. Bring it up.
Yeah, if you have a question, throw it out on the listserv or bring it to a lunch and learn, and we'll definitely try to get those questions answered. Because I mean, when you think about the work we do, I mean, and as much as we've talked about things, even like ADD and ADHD and other disorders, you get people sleeping better and get that anxiety down, and their lives begin to improve in a variety of ways.
Okay, well, it's
Yep.
7:59.
Yep. All right, everybody. We'll see you Wednesday. We have no set agenda for Wednesday, so if you have a particular topic, throw it along. If you have a map, shoot it along, and we'll see you Wednesday.
Okay, see you all then.
Bye, everybody.